Hello, everyone. I'm just going to give it a couple minutes for people to log in, and then we'll get started.
Hi, welcome to this webinar on Revitalizing Clinical Leadership. Today's healthcare environment represents a complex terrain for clinical leadership, featuring many mission-driven imperatives, ranging from healthcare reform, regulatory compliance, work staff shortages, emerging technologies coming out of the pandemic. These are multifaceted challenges that necessitate clinical leadership that's not only proactive, but also visionary, capable, and deciphering readily and rapidly evolving clinical dynamics with an overburdened staff and simultaneously uplifting patient care. I'm Dr. Gian Varbaro. I'm the Chief Medical Officer and Vice President of Ambulatory Services at Bergen Newbridge Medical Center. I want to thank my co-panelists today for joining us. We have two other panelists who will be joining shortly, but in the interim, I'll let Pat introduce himself and then Lisa.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Pat Patton. I am the Chief Nursing Officer at Swedish First Hill in Seattle, Washington, and we're glad to have you join us.
Lisa?
And good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Lisa Lockheed. I am the Chief Nursing Officer and Vice President for Quality for St. Lawrence Health, an affiliate of Rochester Regional Health. We're a 3-hospital system with about 60 outpatient clinics.
Thank you very much. So effective clinical leadership needs to be adaptable and elastic. What best practices can you share that have allowed you to strike an effective balance between managing strategic initiatives, caring for your caregivers, and prioritizing patient outcomes and experience? I'll start with Pat.
You know, John, it's a great question. I think that is the hard part, right? Coming out of the pandemic, and how do we balance all of those together, and how our strategic imperatives have really changed pre-pandemic to post-pandemic, right? We're all around cost savings now. We're around making sure that we maintain market share in order to balance that. We know that everything is fixed with volume, but how do you make sure that you're having things come back? And then how does leadership really tie into that, right? And how do you tie those people in and help your leaders, come into this new world, right, that we're living in? How do you help them adjust, number two? But then how do you help them refocus so that we're continuing to take care of our patients at the bedside and making sure that we're able to move the organization forward with the strategic imperatives that we have at hand?
I think you're completely correct. I think it's a really interesting challenge. Lisa, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. Before you do, I see that Brian and William have just joined us, so I'll let them quickly introduce themselves, and then I will come back to you, Lisa. So Brian, can you just introduce yourself briefly? And I apologize to people watching. We had a little bit of a hold up. So Brian?
Yep, this is Dr. William Bryan. I'm the Market Chief Medical Officer for Tenet Health and the Desert Care Network in California.
And Brian Cotter.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. How are you? Doing well. Hey, I was on a link from the previous panel, and then it was refreshing, so I had to relog into this one. So great to see everyone. Yeah, hey, hello, and great to see everyone. I'm the CEO. I'm currently the CEO of Gateway Regional Medical Center in Granite City, Illinois. But I apologize. I'm in my son's gaming room right now, so if you see some odd posters behind me, he is my 20-some-year-old son into gaming. So I've worked in California for a long time, Arizona, so Northern California, Southern California, and for the last 8 months out in the Midwest in Illinois as the CEO of a hospital. I've been a hospital CEO for the last 15 years or so, but been in healthcare for coming on 40 years.
Great.
So nurse by background.
Oh, fantastic. So what you guys came into, and Lisa was just about to speak to, and Pat had already spoken to, the challenges that we're dealing with clinical leadership at the present time, with all of the different things that are changing in healthcare, all of the different things we're dealing with coming out of the pandemic. and what best practices people can share that they found with finding clinical leadership that can adapt and be flexible. So Lisa, I'm sorry I cut you off before to allow everybody else to introduce themselves.
That's okay. Pat really started off with a great comments. Strategically, revenue cycles and making sure we have the market share are so vital. But I also think we have to stick to basics. It is about the patient experience and patient outcomes. And if we do all of our initiatives really around the patient outcomes and the quality of care we provide, I think we're setting the stage for doing the right thing at the right time. Employee wellness has become even more of a priority strategically for all of us. We recognize that the workforce is ever changing, and trying to come out of the pandemic and prepare for any future pandemics, we have to think about how do we retain the quality staff that we have. Many of us have seen a change in the workforce to become very transient, especially with the travel industry. You work for a few years here, you work for a few years there. So the organizations that can really demonstrate that we're successful in not just having good outcomes, having a good bottom line, but we really create a culture of safety and employee wellness are really the organizations that are going to survive in the upcoming years.
I think you bring out a really good point about establishing culture. I think that that's really kind of central to everything. And to your point, how do you bring that culture to people who are coming external to your organization? I don't know, Brian Cotter, I'll just to differentiate Brian's, if you have any thoughts on that.
One of the things I'm being faced with now, and I don't know if this is germane to the point, coming from different organizations, I've got a kind of a confluence of multiple organizations coming together right now in a change of ownership. But I was copied on a couple of emails last week from some staff nurses, and I feel their pain. And we've all been dealing with this, but market compression, right? We're getting hit up daily by staff saying, I want to raise. And I've been here for 10 years. I've been here, 20 years. But I got a couple of emails last week from some 20 plus year nurses. And when you go through a hiring phase, you bring in not just nurses, but other staff at different market rates. Or if you have a critical need, you raise the salaries, oftentimes to attract talent. But your incumbents are pretty upset about that. And that's one of my challenges right now. Like I said, I got a couple of emails, copied on a couple of emails last week, and pretty lengthy about the time that they have given into the organization, the 20 plus years, and the things that they do, and feeling pretty upset about new staff coming in at or above their current rates with much less experience. So that is a driving factor on a lot of retention of folks.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think equity amongst your workforce is definitely an interesting issue. And again, as we kind of said, as you're bringing more people in or new people in or changing and adapting, it does have an effect on the people who've already been there, who've kind of formed the backbone. And sometimes those people need to change and sometimes they don't because they're the core, and you need to kind of try to balance that. I don't know, William, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that the ever-changing building of culture is a challenge, I think, for every organization. The ones that have been established for a very long period of time and there's not been a lot of turnover of your leadership. I think it's easier to engage new people into the culture that already exists. I know recently, having moved back to California from the Midwest, I'm still trying to gather that culture, and now we're facing, as you probably all know, a significant increase in the minimum wage for healthcare workers starting in January, which is going to further cause the compression that I think Brian has talked about, that we haven't quite seen yet, but we will be seeing soon. And it's going to cause a lot of consternation amongst a lot of the people who are working in the organization. And it tends to then degrade the culture in the organization until you actually get through that process. I don't think that there's a great answer for that, other than as you bring people into your organization, I do think you have to define for them what the culture and expectations are in the organization, and hopefully have that. I'm not sure culturized is the right word, but I think we need to all make sure that we're engaging the new people coming in and making them aware of what that culture is in the organization, what the expectations are, and either they like that culture and they accept it, or they need to find other opportunities, which is hard when you're challenged with your workforce and labor. I will say I'm always struck, moving now into a new organization where you have clear staff ratios in California that you didn't have in Ohio or previously in Texas, and everyone's still saying that they're overworked and they need more staff. It's a challenge. I don't think that there's a great answer to it, but I do think it's a matter of leadership driving what the expectations are. And as Lisa said, in today's world after COVID, sort of getting back to basics and almost re-energizing and restarting where you were at before COVID, which is hard to do.
Yeah. And if I could just add to what Brian and William have both shared, that compression of salaries, if you're in a union environment, it's even more drastic. We recently, in order to negotiate our contracts, gave our frontline nurses a 21% salary increase. There was no way we could do that to our non-union nurses or our nursing leadership. So trying to develop ways and strategies to retain leaders in an organization has been even more challenging, especially discussing it at the C-suite. And how do we now, after we've just asked for millions of dollars to not strike, now also ask for additional funds so we don't have that compression. Very difficult times.
No, definitely. And yeah, if I don't know if any of the other panelists had wanted to say something, feel free to jump in. I completely agree with you. We have a similar environment where I am, and it's tricky. And not just that, if you have competition in the area, it's not just competition. It's not just compression internally, but it's compression compared to other facilities in your area. I don't know if any of the other panelists have any insight into that. Pat, if you had anything to say, or if anyone else had wanted to come back to it.
Well, as Lisa said, we're in a union environment too, and we have literally two other hospitals 2 blocks from us in either direction. Harborview is two blocks that way. We've got, Virginia Mason 2 blocks that way. So I'm trying to keep up with everybody in the 4-block radius, right? Number one. And to Lisa's point, we actually did a good job, as she obviously did with her system. We negotiated a great job for the nurses, and nurses seem to be happy with their hourly rate now. It's now my nursing leaders who are like, hey, wait, Pat, I make 50 cents more than my top nurse, right, to do that. And then they're like, well, why would I want to be a leader? I'll just go back being a nurse and getting shift diff and overtime and et cetera. And so trying to give the leaders the understanding of the why you're in leadership, why this is important, what you're doing makes a big difference. Yes, it would be great if you went to the back of the bedside, but it'd be great if you'd stayed in leadership. But let me tell you why we want you to stay in leadership. So it's always difficult.
I think you bring up a really great point, Pat, and it actually ties into something I see somebody asked in the Q&A, but I think that you're hitting on a general area, which is how do you keep people involved in leadership? What skills do you want to promote within your talent pipeline? But in addition to that, what things are working? Because we can get into this escalating arms war of salaries, and obviously, if it's a huge salary difference, it's going to compare them for some lower level positions. People will leave for a minimal raise. But when you're talking about people at that leadership level, at least in my experience, I've been able to retain people by giving them other things, whether that's a sense of mission and purpose, or other types of strategies, whether it's wellness strategies or work-life balance or retention plans. So I don't know if any of you have some best practices or things that have worked for you.
I can speak about life-work balance. I've had several leaders just recently, when I've had my regular meetings with them, say that they appreciate the fact that they can work remote if they have an all-meeting day, especially now thanks to all these wonderful Zoom meetings. Again, finding ways for our leaders to get some time back, which is different than what a frontline staff would do, plus educational opportunities and making sure we support that, support their growth and development, is really the best strategy we can offer, because we all recognize there's people who are managers and then there's people who are leaders. So really investing in those leaders. So even though, yes, they might be able to make, only 50 cents more than the frontline staff, as a leader, they want all those other things, the fact that they can create and be part of the vision and mission of the organization.
I would add on to that and say, yes, we're doing some of the same things that Lisa is doing here, and they do appreciate that. I think two other things that I have tied into it, as well as what you said, John, around creating the mission and purpose, but also I like, as we're redeveloping shared governance here, we're developing a nurse manager council, so they can come together as a council and govern themselves to figure out what's right for them, what do they want to do, and then tell us what is too much on your plate and what is not, what would you rather be doing instead of doing this versus that, to see, can we take things off of their plate to provide that balance for them. And then finally, I would say that I'm holding like manager retreats. So getting them out of the hospital, having them come over to my house for 4 hours without their director president, so they can just have a good time together as managers. But number two, know that their CNO is listening to them and that they can really have a place to talk. But then I give them some leadership development during that time. So I'm really developing them, continuing to give them the tools and skill sets that they need to do even better than they're already doing.
Yeah, I think that's great. I do a similar thing actually, where I meet with my team pretty frequently, where it's just a more casual setting, and I basically let them kind of talk through aloud what they're thinking of, especially with younger leaders, so that you can help kind of develop them and train them. And I also find that giving people something to own is pretty useful. Instead of just dictating to them, go do this, 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 and this on a checklist, kind of letting them fail a little bit and being there to kind of catch them, to push them in the right direction, I think gets people a little more invested. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that, or just in general, when you're looking at your talent pipeline, are there specific skills or traits that you're looking for fostering to adequately prepare them? And conversely, are there any skills or traits that we used to focus on that you're trying to downplay? Anyone?
One of the first things, you look for is being coachable. Someone who's willing to say, hey, you know what, help me out here. I don't have all the skills and the talents to do this, and thank you for your faith in me. That is probably one of the biggest traits that I look for, is someone who's coachable and willing to look at themselves and say, hey, I need help doing this, because I want to give, if I give something to someone, hey, I got it, I'm going to go do it perfectly. Then they come back and, it may not have happened right. Something went wrong, and they'll come back and say, well, you didn't tell me about this. And you didn't give me the full picture. I'd rather someone come back and say, hey, you know what, help me, coach. What could I have done differently there?
Yeah, Lisa, you were starting to say
Yeah,
something?
I'm probably in a little bit different situation. Where I'm working is extremely rural. So I don't have hospitals around that I could poach people from. We're about 6 hours north of New York City. So we're at the very tip of New York State, very cold area. So I have to look from within. I have done a lot of repurposing of leadership and looking at succession planning to see who wants to grow, and then giving them various opportunities. And some of the opportunities have led to additional responsibilities, and some of the areas have led to people actually saying, look, I really don't want to go into that field now. I'd like to try something else. So using the core group that I have now to keep growing them as our organization grows is a different strategy than trying to look for leaders from the outside.
William, you were starting to say something before too?
Yeah, so I agree. I think Lisa's right. I think the first thing that I want to look for is somebody who actually wants to do the job, wants to take on a leadership role. I think the other component of it is it's got to be a person who actually knows how to engage people. It's one thing to teach people process improvement. It's another thing to teach people how to communicate, engage, and bring people along with them to drive that change. And then I like to look at people who have taken on various tasks, even if they're small tasks on their specific unit, and have been successful in bringing together a team of people, particularly in the hospital world. It's got to be not just the RN collaboratives that go on. You have to be able to engage with the medical staff as well, because if you can't buy in and you can't get buy-in and respect from them, you'll fail miserably. And then it takes leadership from CMOs to actually find the medical staff who actually want to engage and work with the nursing teams to actually drive positive change. And the one thing I would say is that, for both physicians and nurses, at the end of the day, it's about making things better for patients. And I think when you can give them real tools to improve and go along that improvement journey, whatever it may be, collaboration, experience, whatever, when they start working together, it's amazing when they see numbers that actually improve, how much more excited they and other people get. And that's how I think many of the people strive to say, hey, I can do this, I can be a leader. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I would agree with William. One of the things I look for more now, maybe than I did in the past, was the soft skills versus the hard skills. So are you more of a transformational leader or a transactional leader? I can teach you all the transactional skills all day long, and you probably can get those down. But to William's point, can you communicate? Can you collaborate, right? Can you engage with your staff nurse? Can you engage with your nursing assistant? Can you engage with your, unit coordinator that's on your unit? And how do you pull them together as a team? And then how do you, as the manager or director, work with our physician colleagues in order for us to do things together and not separately? I really firmly believe in that nurse-physician dyad partnership and how we just set that up. And we should have one on every single unit. And finding it, we don't have that quite yet at Swedish. We're trying to work on that, and just find that that's a skill set that's a really positive skill set. When we have a medical director and a nursing director that can work together, it always seems to have better outcomes.
Yeah, I can't agree more. I think that communication is such a huge key, and I think you all hit upon some of the really important skills. I think flexibility and communication are really, really important, more so than I think they used to be. But you both hit upon communication, and particularly, I think open, honest, effective communication, especially coming out of the pandemic in periods of high stress or change. I'm sure that communication strategy, I think, was very pivotal for all of us, probably in the height of the pandemic. But are there any in particular circumstances you can think of where communication strategy was really pivotal in overcoming a challenging situation or moving the organization forward?
I've got a comment on here, and this is I'm finding it's more operational communication. My CNO and my COO and my HR folks, they are filling shifts not like how we used to fill shifts years ago.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many apps and electronic ways to communicate to nurses, and I think there's an emerging, these emerging workforces generationally, communicate differently, and a lot of it's through the phone and through an app. So communication is changed. I mean, there's a lot of communication with leaders, but I think that's evolving right now, and a lot of our communication, a good portion of it centers around staffing, centers around different patient care things, and the HIPAA compliant communication is with the medical staff too. talking to colleagues, and I see a lot of I guess electronic-based communication happening now.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, right? The balance between different ways to communicate, use of technology, and then the regulatory side of how do we keep it all HIPAA compliant, because obviously everybody likes the text, or it's the easiest way, I think, to get in touch with people when you're talking about patient care, and you're also talking about staffing. And I think that there was an interesting point that came up earlier about how, I think staffing sometimes becomes a little bit of a chasing its tail issue, where you can never have enough staffing, right? You always feel like you could use more, because we also keep adding more stuff for people to do. So I guess the question is, how do we find the balance between all of those things? And I don't know if there is a good answer to that, but I thought it could be an interesting conversation of how do you find a balance between technology, communication, patient care, which is obviously the most important part, the need for people to have better staffing, and also the fact that we keep adding more and more tasks onto our providers of all kinds, nursing, physicians, and techs, physical therapists, everybody. So I know it's a very general question, but I think might be an interesting conversation.
Well, John, it's funny you bring up this question, because this just happened to me last week as I was rounding on the unit. A hospitalist was sitting at the desk charting, and I said, "How's it going?" And he said, "It's going well." And I said, "Anything going on?" He said, "Nope." I said, "Are you sure?" And he said, "Well, since you're here, let me talk to you." And he said, "Your nurses love the chat feature on Epic, and they love to chat with me. And so my chat gets filled up." And then he said, "I just wish they would call me." First time in my career, a physician said, would they just call me instead of chat with me? Because to Brian's point, the electronic portion of our new era of caregivers is really, they're used to that, right? They're used to not talking to anyone. They can text, they can chat, they can do it on an app, whatever. And so we're now trying to have to figure out what is the best way to communicate without calling our physicians so much and without using the chat. So we haven't figured it out yet, but it'll be interesting to see where that goes.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about it that way, but it makes total sense to me as a physician, as somebody who started their career as a hospitalist. Yeah, sometimes just a conversation, you get so much more across than texting or email or anything like that. I get what the doctor was talking about. It's really interesting response to hear from them. I don't know if anybody else has any similar insights.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the challenge is the balance between effectiveness and efficiencies around that. When you call somebody and you get a voicemail, and then you wait for them to call back, and you're busy, the nurse is busy taking care of a patient, you go back and forth. Texting is clearly has become a much more effective and efficient way. You can document when someone's received a HIPAA compliant text, and you can respond back with information. I think that component's great. I do think, though, that they're a little bit more of the older school. I prefer picking up the phone and talking to people. It's just my style. I think for me, it's more effective and efficient when I get in touch with them. And I guess because I'm a leader, they tend to answer their phone quicker than sometimes other people do. So I don't have to go and play the phone tag. But I do think that texting is important. I think that as an organization, though, we have to get back to sort of the basics of care and move away from adding more and more and more on to the healthcare providers. And at some point, it really is looking and saying, okay, we're just not going to do all of this anymore in the organization. We're going to focus on care. We're going to focus on communication and experience, and we're going to help teach you how to be effective and efficient. I sometimes pine for the days where I could write my note in the chart because it was 5 lines. There was nothing to copy and paste. And now you go through a consult from somebody, and it's 15 pages of nothing, and you get to the final somewhere embedded in the discussion of what you actually want to do, and it's not readily even readable there. And I think that those are things that we've done that have made the workflow more challenging for people, and we have to get back to sort of teaching them the etiquette of what they really need to put in there and what everyone really wants to see, and that'll make people more effective and efficient. And I do think phone calls are great, but texting is also a nice way to cut to the chase, because people, when they text, it's different than cutting and pasting a note that you can't find anything in. and you scroll through for a long period of time.
I think you're really right. I think there's been this real interesting push-pull and so pendulum swing. I think my whole career I've seen pendulum swing back and forth on various different things, and this is an interesting one because I'm old enough to remember paper charts and spending large amount of time searching for the paper charts. So it wasn't like there wasn't wasted time then too, but also sitting there when people would write very brief notes where you couldn't understand what they were doing. But now I agree with you. I think we data dump and it's like finding a needle in the haystack to find what they're trying to communicate. I think that leads to a broader question, which is as we continue to bring technology into healthcare, whether it's from a data standpoint or just technology standpoint with digital transformation, how do we make sure that they actually boost our workflows and efficiencies? Like, how do we get an actual change management? Because a big part of the reason these things were put into systems was to ensure that we were doing the right quality things. So how much of it is actually just a behavior modification? How much of it is balanceable with technology? And how do we find the sweet spot in between? And again, I don't know that there's an answer to that, but I figured I'd put it out to my fellow panelists. No one's got anything for that?
Well, I think, we've certainly looked at different ways to use technology to communicate, even platforms like LinkedIn and whatnot to get the word out. One thing I just want to add about communication that I don't think we touched on is that it's not just internal communication, it's also external. One thing that I've done much differently in the last year, and it was because our negotiations with our union were so contentious, is I've changed the way I strategize and communicate to our boards and to the community. All of my board members now know our retention recruitment rates. I never used to share that. I never used to share turnover rates. But they're very interested to know, what are we doing to retain nurses? Are we bringing in technology to offload the workforce? So I've got a Moxie computer coming in, a Moxie robot coming in, so that the nurses don't have to run errands. I've got different computers being installed to do better vital sign monitoring. The board members want to know about what technology are we using to help our workforce be happy and stay, so we don't ever get to a strike again. So I think we've really changed the way we do things in recent years.
That's a really great point. I think, yeah, you're right. We've been very focused at Bergen Newbridge on social media communication with the community too, just because that's, whether you like it or not, that's where a lot of people go to for communication about healthcare or getting information. We did a lot of explainers for different things, and we're very out there. I think that's really interesting. There was an interesting question, kind of a different tack, but also in the communication realm in the Q&A that I thought was interesting, which was, how do we also ensure that with all of these different things we're talking about, that the communication and that the alignment is there between the senior leadership and the team leaders on a more granular level? Because it's very easy. I know we find this at Bergen Newbridge at my hospital, that we'll hear people, frontline staff, saying things like, the management does this, the management does that. And on the senior team, we're like, who's doing that? And they're assigning different things to people who aren't even necessarily team leaders, but it becomes an amorphous management team. So I'm wondering, excuse me, if any of you have any thoughts on how to communicate and align that.
Well, I can start. One of the things that that I appreciate about the Swedish system, we're part in the Central Puget Sound, part of a 4-hospital system, and we hold a core leader meeting every week for 30 minutes, and then once a month we expand it to an hour and a half. And during that core leader meeting, we give out pertinent information, but also ask for questions. And just so that both the frontline leaders and the senior leadership are on the same page, and we're all hearing the same things at the same time. And our core leaders, which goes from supervisor to manager to director to VP, can all ask questions and can all give comments at the same time to do that. And then every day during our tier huddle, we always have, what do you want to escalate to tier 4, which is senior leadership? And they can escalate whatever they want to escalate. And then it's a responsibility of one senior leader on that core team to get back to that leader and say, I heard your request, I heard your comment, here's what we're doing about it in that space. So that's how we're trying to keep our team on all levels of leadership in alignment.
I like the ideas that Pat just shared. I never heard about that tiered 4, and I do a tiered huddle every day as well. So thank you for educating me on that. But I think you can never over communicate. This week in particular, we're actually doing town halls at every one of our campuses. We've got several members of the senior leadership team doing presentations so that everybody has the opportunity to have those in-person meetings again post-COVID, which I think people appreciate. Newsletters are great. Social media is great, but sometimes people just want to have an opportunity to have an actual conversation and ask their questions in a open forum.
Yeah, we do town halls, we do leadership rounding. We talk about community communication. One role that I had in California, in a medium-sized town, and this just one in particular, was really getting involved in the community. I'm usually involved in the community wherever I go, but community perception of the hospital is very different than what you think it is. And one way that I found to kind of help drive that perception of the hospital was to be involved, have senior leadership involved in the communities that surround the hospital, whether it's volunteer groups, service organizations, attending city council meetings, being involved with youth sports, getting involved with your local representatives. We would have every other Wednesday we had a little coffee meet at a local restaurant diner. I was heavily involved in Kiwanis, just doing a lot of things in the community and being able to show that the hospital cares. There's a lot of times when we see on social media about the ER or so and so, it's the rant instead of the rave, and you get a lot of hard knocks. You want to be able to shape that perception that the leadership of the hospital has a heart and they actually care for the community, and they see you out there supporting the youth football teams, the baseball teams, giving clothes to kids for Christmas, and that the leadership of the hospital has a heart and they care. They're not just the mean employer that that people will talk about on social media.
That's great, Brian. I really appreciate that. I think that's a really good overview, and or a really good philosophy, I should say, not overview. There was also an interesting question in the Q&A, kind of again in the same lines, around how do you change your employer brand so that we are recruiting the right kind of people. And you kind of hit on that a little bit, Brian, when you were speaking. You talked a little bit about the mean employer, but I definitely agree with you. I think that that's a really important piece as well, because we want to start with getting good people, I think, and I think that's where it all starts from. And good talents turns into good leaders, turns into helping you kind of flex the organization. But I don't know what people's thoughts are on that.
So I've always thought that it's great to go to the meetings, and I too have been involved in various community activities. But I think it's equally important to bring your rank and file staff members out and get them engaged in the community, because they're the people who, when they talk, people actually they say, oh yeah, I remember when my nurse took care of me on the floor, or when my pharmacist came in and helped me with some medication. And so when you bring the rank and file in to the same meetings, whether it's Rotary or other service meetings, when they're out and about at service events in the community, they're the ones who people gravitate to. And that's a really strong connection in presenting the culture of your organization, not the person wearing a coat and tie and being out there saying we're great. It's actually the people who are actually doing the work day to day makes a big difference.
Absolutely. I think that was a really nice way to sum this up. I completely agree with you. I think that having touch with the communities is so important. We have about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to go in a little bit of a different direction and talk a little bit about strategy. Specifically, we've started talking about all of the various challenges that healthcare systems are facing right now and how we have to change our leadership. But one of the other challenges that we're facing is how do we prioritize existing services or optimize services or figure out new services to go into, and how do we how do you decide to do that? How do you decide if you're going to do something unconventional or innovative? What's your guidelines to inform service plannings or cut through the complexity? And I can speak a little to it because Newbridge, we're a safety net hospital with 4 large systems around us, and we started kind of behind everybody else, so we've been forced to be innovative. Is the only way for us to make a mark in the market. But I think that for other people who come from systems that are more established, I think it's a really interesting question of how do you make that determination? How do you foster the leadership that can do that? How do you engage your leadership and your teams to do that?
So one thing that I've done with my leaders is really given them the opportunity to think outside of the box and come up with business plans that they think would benefit us, and really giving them the education about how to create a business plan. Don't worry about the funding. Just come up with the model, come up with the innovative idea, and then we'll bring a team to the table to help you. Now, whether it's something we can build into our capital budget or our operating budget, or if it's something we have to go look for grant opportunities. But I don't want to lose that imagination and innovation. So, John, I think you mentioned earlier about letting leaders fail. This is a really great example that I've had in my organization. Come to the table with a new strategy, a new service line. We may at the end of the day say we're not going to move forward on it for X, Y, and Z reasons, but at least give the leaders that opportunity to try to come up with an innovative plan.
Wow. I think I agree with you. Does anybody else have anything to add?
Well, in a private for-profit system or a hospital right now, how much money is it going to make? I'm very heavily involved in rev cycle and bringing in cash and being able to pay the bills. What's the investment on it? And also, if our competitor is doing it, it's either a good thing or a bad thing. Sometimes you don't want to, you want to do what they're doing, but you also don't want to do what they're doing. But doing something innovative, but in my position right now, I have to look at what's the return on investment in the short term, and what's my investment into this? Can I afford to get into this? But what's my ROI, and how soon will it bring in cash, and how sustainable is it?
You bring up a really good point, which I was you went there before I was able to, which was how do you determine the horizon on the return on investment, right? Because obviously we've all analyzed things where it's like, this is a really good idea, but it's good for us 5 years from now. This is a really good idea. It's not as good, but it's good in 6 months. And how do you find that balance? And especially when we're not just dealing with the regular healthcare environment, but also, seeing all of these external players who are coming into healthcare. You're seeing big corporations buy into healthcare. And personally, I have a fear that that we're going to turn into the famous business school case of Kodak having the digital camera before anybody else. And so they didn't want to go into it because they thought it was going to eat up their profits. But in the end, somebody else just ate up their profits. So I guess the question is, how do we find that balance between doing the thing that's going to allow us to stay ahead of those companies, but having to keep the lights on in the short run? And I don't know that there's a good answer to that. So I don't know if anybody's done a lot of thinking on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's a great answer. I think Brian is right. I mean, you have to look at your ROI on these. You also have to look at what the cost to the organization is from a time and staff perspective. Because again, when you add in a new project or a new program, you're adding in more for your staff to do, and you're typically not adding the commensurate number of people that would be needed to do this as a standalone project. So I think that you have to be, because again, you're asking people now to do more with maybe a little bit more than they had before, but not a commensurate amount. So that's a challenge. I think the other thing that it's really hard for organizations to do, and I agree with Brian, is, you know, what is the competitor doing? Let's compete with them. I actually always like to look and say, what do we do really well? What are our strengths? And let's build on our strength, as opposed to finding something that we're weak in, and let's add that in and build and compete against somebody who already does it pretty well. Build on your strengths, and you can actually grow the surrounding ancillary programs around that, and maybe add on in areas where you might otherwise not have planned to, because you were doing pretty well. And that's sort of that you brought up, the technology around Kodak. That's where you actually build off of what you have and continue to grow. And eventually you may be able to incorporate some of those other areas that you're weaker in and convert them into strengths over time.
I can't agree with you more. I think that's always been what I've always believed, is that you try to build off of your strengths. I think too often in healthcare, we chase after what everybody else is doing instead of what we should be doing. And I think you said it really well, William. We decide we have to do it because everybody else is, and we do a bad job of it instead of thinking, what could we be ahead of the pack on? And I agree. I think that's the best strategy going forward for finding those ways into new service lines or evaluating them. Anything else that anybody had on that topic? Otherwise, we're nearing the end of our time. One last, just I guess, parting thought. The biggest story in healthcare the last several years has obviously been the pandemic, and it taught us the importance of being prepared and having resilience. I think we've kind of hit upon it, but are there any closing thoughts or any qualities that you built in your teams that you want to try to keep going forward, that positives to come out of that, or lessons that you've taken to help prepare for future crises, or for even the quote unquote crisis we're in of trying to reinvent healthcare?
I think the remote work, the remote working process, you know, we weren't really, I wasn't ready for it prior to COVID and during COVID, but I got much more comfortable with it. And I think our processes for accountability and communication with remote work and being able to keep, you know, achieving our goals throughout the day and throughout the, you know, the time periods. I think that being able to work remotely now and still achieve goals is something that we came away with.
Yeah, I think that very true. And I think the other component from that is the telehealth component of it, a different topic. But you know, telehealth, now every one of your hospitals doesn't have to provide the same service. When you have that service at one core hospital, and another service at another core hospital in your system, you can leverage that by using telehealth in a very effective way without having to create redundancy. And I think that that's something that's come out of the COVID remote workforce. And the other thing I would just add is, you know, I think that there have always been the one-off issues. Obviously, the pandemic was something that was unique, but now, you know, you have a storm that comes through that you weren't expecting, and we were able to use our COVID preparation and just dial that up right away in a very efficient and effective manner. And I think that that's something that you just have to keep using your emergency plans whenever there is an emergency that comes up. If nothing else, even if you don't need it, it just turns the system back on again and gets everybody ready for the time where you may really need the whole thing revved up and moving.
Yeah, I would agree.
Oh,
Go ahead, Lisa.
Well, go ahead.
No, I would say I agree with Brian and William. I think the other thing that we've learned coming post-pandemic is that change can happen, and change can happen quickly. So don't be afraid to change, because we'll get through it. We'll probably mess up along the way, but we'll fix it and we'll keep on going. So change is inevitable, and we know that we can do it.
Fantastic parting thought. Lisa, do you have any last words?
I think one thing we have to make sure we keep in the forefront that this last pandemic was different than those we've seen over the years in the fact that it changed our workforce. What the travel industry and the workforce evolved to post-COVID has really impacted all of us in healthcare. So we have to be more resilient about thinking about how do we make sure our workforce is engaged, and we look at workforce in a different way. It's not somebody that's going to be with the company for 25 years anymore. It's how do we make sure that we keep the workers that are present today working at their highest level, because they may be a very different workforce than tomorrow.
I couldn't agree more. Unless anybody else has any parting thoughts, I think that was a really nice way to end this. And I thank everybody. I learned a lot speaking with all of you, and thank you everybody for joining us today on this panel.